stand by on the camera?
No, it's on. It's ready. Go. Shoot.
My name is Karen Hill, and I'm doing an interview for the Oral History of Social Work in Canada project that's being sponsored by the Canadian Association of Social Workers. We're in Ottawa on December the 10th, 1983, interviewing Shimizu. Kay, in order to begin the interview today, I wonder if you'd first give us your full name and tell us a little bit about where you were born and your early background.
Actually, my name is Kiyoshi Shimizu, and I was born in British Columbia near an Indian village by Night Inlet. The village was actually located on Kincum Inlet, and my earliest recollections, and I guess I must have been about 3 years of age then, were of the beautiful totem poles that were part of that Indian village. My mother and father, my father was a fisherman, and there was a clams cannery located near that village, and a floating colony of Japanese fishermen who sold their fish to that cannery.
A floating village, was that where you lived?
Yeah, that's the impression I have of those early days. But then I was only 3 years old when we left the city, because my father died, and my mother married his older brother, who was a logger. And so my next recollection of those early days were of living in a logging camp. And then when my sister reached the age of 6, and she was 2 years older than I was, we moved to Vancouver so that she could start school in the fishing village and in the logging camps. I guess there were school facilities were too far away. And we moved into an extremely interesting a living arrangement in Vancouver. Japanese landlords built longhouses, and in these longhouses, about 6 families shared the accommodation, and there were a number of such buildings in Vancouver East. Within about 4 blocks, it must have been 4 longhouses, in which Japanese families lived cooperatively, and our family lived in one of those houses for about 9 years.
When you say longhouses, could you describe them a bit?
I have a feeling that the Indian longhouses were maybe derived from such arrangements in the Orient. Because they were called nagaya, which is the literal translation would be longhouse. They existed in Japan, I think, in the urban areas. I mean, the term nagaya is used, I think, to refer to kind of communal living arrangements in some of the urbanized areas of Japan, where families shared some of the facilities. For instance, in this longhouse, there was a bathhouse that we all shared, and that was one of the nice features of the longhouse, actually.
Yes.
So that probably these Japanese landlords who built the longhouses saw them as places where families who came from Japan could find a substitute for the extended family by living under those arrangements.
Could you describe the neighborhood that you lived in at that time?
I grew up in Vancouver East, And the public school that I went to had some Japanese children, but we were a real minority. My sister had a great deal of difficulty when we first moved into Vancouver to learn the English language. And so she taught me everything that she learned every single day she came home from school. By the time I went to school, I had a real head start on being able to read everything that she had read to me, and I could speak English as well as she could, and so I became the interpreter for the Japanese children who were in my class. There must have been about 3 or 4, and so then I really got ahead in school in a way that very few children of immigrant families were able to. And I'm really grateful to my sister for having given me that head start.
So in your home then, what was the first language?
Well, whenever we entered the family situation, it was always Japanese. Though my mother and father lived in Canada for all those years, they really never learned to speak Japanese fluently. The discrimination against the minorities in those days was really very extreme, and particularly against the Orientals. And so we lived really separate lives from the rest of society in a Japanese community.
In the community, you had mentioned earlier that there were 6 of these long houses.
There were 6 families who shared the particular longhouse that we lived in.
Were there other Japanese and Japanese Canadians around the longhouse that you lived in?
No, there was one maybe in the 4-block area that I mentioned earlier, and we had a very active kind of life, social life among the families that shared the longhouse, but very little contact with our neighbors.
And your neighbors would have been Caucasian?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
As you began school in the primary grades, what kind of treatment were you experiencing at that age?
Well, I was conscious of the fact that we were not mixing quite as readily with non-Japanese children, that there were differences between those of us who lived in the longhouse and the other children on the block. My mother and father made a conscious decision to send us to the local Anglican church, which was just around the corner from our longhouse. And the other families there brought up their children in the Buddhist tradition. But because Mother and Dad felt that we were going to remain in Canada, and my father already had his citizenship, he had to have his citizenship in order to fish. My father, or my stepfather, uncle, who was a logger, also had his citizenship because I guess at one time he also fished. Anyways, once the children arrived and started school, they certainly felt that their future lay in Canada. I think other families maybe felt that if they could make a fortune in Canada, they might consider returning to Japan. So maybe, there were slight differences between the way in which my family viewed their life in Canada, and, some of the other families. I know that once the Anglican Church set up a mission in that neighborhood, and that we were encouraged not to go to the local church, but to attend the Anglican mission, and I think that was a mistake.
Were you conscious?
Because I was beginning to, mingle more with other children who were non-Japanese.
At this early age, you were conscious of the wishes of the mission that you attend there, rather than at the. How did you deal with their wishes?
Well, instead of when the church around the corner actually was moved, and it moved maybe 6 or 7 blocks away, and at that point, instead of going to the church around the corner, we attended the mission Sunday school.
As time went on, did you continue in that neighborhood for the rest of your
No, we
time
moved
here?
away when I was 13, and my mother at that point started a dressmaking shop, so we moved to the West End, not very far from the university grounds, actually. And the shop did quite well. Eventually, we just before the war, we bought a house. And when we bought a house, we my family decided to buy it in the East End. And so we moved to a house that was not that far away from the Longhouse.
Going back to where you had come from. What kind of work was your stepfather doing during this period of time?
Well, my mother's life was really full of tragedy. She lost her first husband, and then I guess when I was 4, shortly after, my stepfather was crippled in a logging accident. He fell down a cliff and crushed his leg, and for the next 9 years, he was in and out of hospital, mostly in hospital, as bone chips, came out of his leg, and eventually I think the whole shin bone had to be replaced by a silver plate. So that, though that period must have been a very difficult time for my mother, I don't remember it as being that tough, because there were so many other mothers to look after us when mother had to go to the hospital, or when she was not in a mood to deal with us, we could always find another mother to deal with us. And when I think of those Longhouse years, I think though they must have been very hard years for my mother, they certainly haven't left that kind of impression for me. And I think it's because of the way in which those families shared their difficulties and helped in times of difficulty.
During some of the years that you would have been in the Longhouse would have been during the Depression, Kay.
That's right.
Do you remember any impacts that the Depression had on you in your life?
Well, it was during the worst of the Depression that actually my mother started the dressmaking shop. Earlier, you see, we lived on workman's compensation, and I don't remember those years as being really tough financially, though I guess they weren't all that great. But in 1933, the workman's compensation was cut from $60 a month to $25 a month, and mother found it impossible. I can remember they're going to the welfare department, whatever it was called then, and getting bags of food that we were not used to cooking. And so for about 6 months, I think we were receiving guess they called it relief. But we didn't get it in cash, we got it in kind. And, you know, by that time my sister was learning how to cook at school. And I remember one of the things that she learned to cook was macaroni and cheese, and we had macaroni and cheese because that was what came in the grocery bag that Mother got from the relief office.
Yes.
There were all kinds of other ways in which we had to change the way in which we ate because of the food that was given to us. And we had no choice, you know, in purchasing that food.
A number of lifestyle changes then that came about during those years as you moved from the East End to the West End, and your mother started working full-time.
Yeah, well, even, you know, earlier, she had, I guess she felt that she had to find some way of increasing the family income, and she did piecework. She had a cousin who had a dressmaking shop and a dress factory, I guess, as well as making custom-made clothing. And Mother did piecework. When my sister and I were called into service to turn belts and to sew on buttons, and my sister, who was very skilled at that, really was a big help. I don't think I was all that helpful, but I did learn to sew. And that was part of trying to increase the family income. My mother was really quite clever, and she taught the other women in the Longhouse how to sew after she learned how to sew.
As time went on, Kay, were you you continued on your education in first East Vancouver, and then I assume you went to what grade?
I went, well, I went
West
to
End?
a junior high school in that area, and then eventually when we moved, I was in grade 9 and went to a Kitsilano junior and senior high school and did very well in school and ended up with a scholarship to the university. I knew that if I didn't win a scholarship, there wouldn't be much chance of my going on with my education. And I really worked very hard at memorizing all the books that all the information that I needed to spew out at exams. And my reward was to be able to go on with my education.
To continue.
It was one way of really pleasing my mother. She felt that I wasn't much good at the sewing and the domestic chores that had to be done, and I knew I could please my parents by bringing home good marks from school. And I guess that really was a big highlight in my life when I won that scholarship to university.
Then you were able to go on with your education.
Yeah.
Kay, I imagine this must have been around 1936, 1937, 38 or so. What was happening regarding the conflicts that were going on in Europe and in Asia at that time? Were they impacting on you?
Yeah, I think, you know, the Japanese Canadians who went on to university were finding it very difficult to get jobs, even after graduating from university. A number of them went to Japan because opportunities in Japan with both Japanese and English as part of their of the skills that they possessed were better. But about 1938, I know that there was a group who graduated, who were in their final year, the year that I entered university, who felt very differently about opportunities for themselves in Canada, and that no matter if they had to settle for gardening jobs or laboring jobs in the paper mills or other kinds of makeshift arrangements, that they should really stay in Canada and look for opportunities that might open up. And there was a lot of discussion during that year that I entered university in the Japanese Students Club at university about going east if opportunities didn't open up for them in British Columbia. British Columbia, you see, we didn't have the franchise. And because we couldn't vote, a lot of professions were closed to us. You couldn't become a lawyer or an engineer. It's very difficult to get into teaching. You couldn't work in the mines. There were a number of prohibitions that made it very difficult for an engineer, for instance, to get a job, or for someone to go on with technical training. One of the things that you had to do in order to get medical training, for instance, was to go to some eastern university. The University of British Columbia didn't provide anything beyond a master's degree. The university was very small, about 1,800 students. It's now about 10 times larger than that. And so it was difficult to consider going beyond an undergraduate degree if you didn't have a wealthy family to support you to do more than that. I started thinking I'd like to be a librarian, and worked in the university library as a very sympathetic reference librarian who was interested in giving me the opportunity at least to earn some pin money working around the library. And in my second year, she investigated the possibility of my being accepted maybe on a scholarship or by one of the libraries in the East. And she came to me one day and said, you know, they won't even admit you to the library school. I think that those were the days when maybe Jewish students couldn't be admitted to library schools. And she was pretty upset about that piece of information. But I said, well, I'm not surprised really, because so many professions are not open to Orientals.
So the discrimination that was affecting you was something that had been a part of your life.
Oh yeah, yes. And so, I didn't find it surprising that the library schools, I think the University of Toronto Library School was another library school, and I can't remember which university it was. She had explored those two and said, because you're Japanese, because you're Oriental, you're not even going to be considered for admission, let alone for a scholarship. And so in my third year, I began to wonder what I might be able to do. And there certainly was a need for someone to work for the Japanese Welfare Federation as a social worker. And it seemed to me that that profession ought to be more open to the possibility of admitting a Japanese student. And so I switched over my courses from languages to sociology and psychology in order to qualify for admission to the, I guess it was called the Department of Social Work at the time, and it was not a school. And you had to have your BA in order to be admitted, and the department provided a social work diploma.
Had you, were there social workers whom you knew at the time as you were finishing your BA?
No, not really. It was a thought of being a pioneer in some field that attracted me into, well, being a librarian was something that I guess I felt I wanted to be because, at the age of 8, when I learned to read and found the library and read everything from A to Z in the children's section from then until the age of 13, I guess. you know, it just sounded like a really nice place to work in. I never talked to the librarian. I was too shy to talk to the librarians. But the resources of the library really opened up a whole new world to me. And that's, but I also had in mind that, you know, there'd never been a professionally trained librarian among the Japanese Canadians, and that was an area in which maybe I could pioneer. So when I looked at other possibilities for a girl, you know, both back in those days, you were still thinking in terms of limited vocational opportunities for women. The next best thing to consider was social work. And then when I graduated in the spring of 41, and applied to the schools, to the Department of Social Work, I was really upset when the school turned me down. They felt that it would be very difficult to find a fieldwork placement for an Oriental student. And I was really turned down very gently, but flatly. And one of the exciting things that happened to me the day after school turned me down was an unexpected meeting with J.S. Woodsworth.
Yes.
Who is the founder of the CCF. Mr. Woodsworth had been rejected by his party for his pacifist ideas. And the day I met him, he was staying with a minister friend. He and his wife were staying with a minister's family in the neighborhood in which my mother had the shop. And I had finished shortening a coat for the minister's daughter, and had to deliver it to their home because she wanted to wear it the next day. And the minister's family were away, but Mr. Woodsworth and his wife were minding the house and took the coat in. And Mr. Woodsworth said to me, "You're not Japanese by any chance?" And I said, "I was. I'm reading an interesting article about pulp and paper mill workers in Ocean Falls and the differential in wages between the Oriental workers and the other workers. And I'd just like to ask you a few questions." Yeah, at that point, I didn't know he was J.S. Woodsworth. Mm-hmm. But I came from a family that were interested in the labor movement, and I knew quite a bit about the subject. And so we talked about the labor conditions for Oriental workers and about things in general for about an hour. And I was really fascinated by the way in which he introduced a number of interesting subjects. And then he started talking about the war, the possibility of war in the Pacific. And he became quite upset and agitated. And at that point, I began to realize that it might be J.S. Woodsworth. His wife came in at that point from the kitchen and said, "I'm going to have to ask this young lady to leave because you're upsetting yourself." And at that point I said, "You know, I realize now who I'm talking to. I know all about you. You've got to be J.S. Woodsworth." And he was. Now, he said to his wife, "Will you bring us a cup of tea? Because I haven't asked this young lady what she's doing with her life. We've been talking about a lot of other things. I've been talking about a lot of other things. I'd like to ask her what she's doing." And so for the next hour, we talked about, of course, I was so excited about meeting J.S. Woodsworth that I wanted to ask him about, you know, how he felt about the way in which his party had treated him, and about, you know, what happened in Winnipeg, and you know, he had left the church to be a longshoreman. Oh, I knew a lot about him, so I wanted to ask him about all these things. And he didn't tell me what to do with my life, but he made it, he made me feel that one person as dedicated as himself could really do something about changing, you know, the course of people's lives. And so after spending that 2 hours with Mr. Woodsworth and being scolded by my family for having stayed away for those 2 hours, I thought about what I might do if I wanted to get into the School of Social Work. So I found 2 fieldwork placements. Actually went to Council on Social Agencies and talked to the executive director there. It's Marjorie Bradford, who's another pioneer social worker. She, I think, must have still been in her late 20s and head of the Council of Social Agencies in the city of Vancouver. So really a very outstanding social worker. And I asked for an interview with her and discussed my dilemma. And she said, now, let me think. There's a lot of Oriental patients in the TB hospitals, and I'm sure that Margaret Johnson, who is head of TB social service, would be very happy to have a Japanese-speaking student. Why don't you go ask her about a placement? And then the Y had recently hired a Chinese worker. And so Ms. Bradford suggested that I might talk to Margaret Hart, who was the Chinese workers' supervisor, and see what arrangements might be made for a fieldwork placement there. And then she said to me, well, the Japanese Welfare Federation would surely be interested in knowing that there's somebody who wants to become a social worker. I'm sure the, I don't know what they called it then, the equivalent to the United Way, would increase funding to the Japanese Welfare Federation to hire a social worker, because they have recently hired a public health nurse. And so it might be worthwhile talking to the executive secretary of the Japanese Welfare Federation. It turned out to be Kunio Shimizu. And he had graduated in physics and maths in 1938. I knew him, because in my first year he was in his last year. And he was the bilingual secretary of 3 organizations in town. Though he graduated in physics and maths, he couldn't find a job in his field. And one of the jobs he had was being the bilingual secretary of the Japanese Welfare Federation. I had a hard time convincing my family that I should consider a job with the Japanese Welfare Federation. I think they felt that it would be okay for me to go and work for a non-Japanese organization as a social worker, but to work in the Japanese community was something that, because the Federation was managed by businessmen in the Japanese community, they felt that maybe that was not the best place for me to consider working. They were very, my family were very radical in their thinking. As a result of my father's years in hospital, he began to do a lot of reading, which led him to feel that society, the ways systems worked were to the disadvantage of the poor and the vulnerable. And so there was a intense interest on the part of, on his part, in organizing things like co-ops and labor unions and a lot of discussion around in my family about I don't know how to express it. Some of it was very confused thinking, I think, but they were part of a radical group within the Japanese community, and very suspicious of the establishment, and they felt that by becoming an employee of the Japanese Welfare Federation, I would be co-opted by the establishment. And the way to help the poor was not to work with the establishment, but to work outside the establishment and to radicalize and politicize people into understanding how systems exploited the poor and the weak.
How did they feel then about the idea of you becoming a social worker?
Yeah, there was some skepticism about whether I could really do anything very effective by being an employee of the Japanese Welfare Federation, for one thing. However, they once I was accepted by the school, they certainly went along with letting me continue my schooling. But in 1941 was the year of Pearl Harbor, and I had some great deal of difficulty even finishing up with that fieldwork placements that I managed to find for myself. I'm probably the first student in the schools of social work that negotiated their own fieldwork placement.
So that was how you were admitted to the School of Social Work. Could you say a little bit about?
I went back to the school. I went back to the school and said, TB Social Services will be glad to take me on as a student. I've already discussed it with Margaret Johnson. I have been to see Margaret Hart at the Y, and she would be happy to have me as a student. I've gone to the Japanese Welfare Federation, and they will hire me once I finish my training. They just could not turn me down as a student in the school. And then, so I became, and I became the most important student in the class because Pearl Harbor came along. And Amy Lee, who's another pioneer social worker you probably might consider interviewing. I think she's still living in Vancouver, and she's probably in her 80s. And I know I met her when she was just 80. She was still very spry then. She became, after Pearl Harbor, she was on loan to the BC Security Commission to organize the welfare services to look after families who are having difficulties. And she came to the school and said, is there any way in which I can have that Japanese-speaking student of yours to work with me in the work that she had to do to resolve some of the problems that she was facing. And so instead of going to TB Social Service, I started my field work with the Y, and in the midst of it, Pearl Harbor happened, and I couldn't get out after sundown, so I couldn't really complete my field work because a lot of my field work was in the evenings. And there were some shifts that were made by Margaret Hart, who was really very anxious to help me complete my requirements for the certificate. And eventually I qualified by doing some Saturday morning work with young children instead of completing the field work with the young adults.
Okay, before we go on to your field placement, which I'm most interested in hearing more about, do you have recollections about the discussion about the entry of Japan into the war in 1941. What was happening around the School of Social Work over the next couple of months after Pearl Harbor?
Well, I don't, it seems to me that students at university live in a very isolated, cut off from even the stresses of the war. Well, there were fewer men around campus because a great many of them had enlisted, and there was a lot of activity around the COTC for those students who were still, for those men who were still around campus and were being trained as part of that COTC activity. I know there were only 2 male students in our class. Aside from that, and then the fact that some of us were learning first aid and home nursing and stuff like that. My impressions of that, of going to university during those war years, was that it didn't seem to be affecting us all that much. Now, in the Japanese community, I think we were a little anxious about what was going on, and before Pearl Harbor, those of us over 21 years of age had to be fingerprinted and photographed and carry identification. And because of the situation in the Far East, we felt maybe that was something we had to accept. And so we submitted to all this fingerprinting and carrying around an identification card. When Pearl Harbor happened, and I could no longer go out after sundown, because the curfew was imposed on us shortly after Pearl Harbor. So I couldn't join the rest of the class in some of the parties that they had. Though there were a couple of times when the one of the male students who had a car, they had a great deal of fun trying to get me out of the house after sundown, covered with a blanket in his car and getting to some event at night. I can remember that conspiracy. But I guess part of it was you pretended that things were normal, and so I can't remember that it made that much difference to those students who were in the School of Social Work at the time, or the Department of Social Work at the time.
And moving back then to the field placement you did with the work that you did with the BC Security Commission. Could you describe what you were doing and where?
Yeah, during the year and a half that this program required before you were given a certificate, there were 2 pieces of field work that you had to complete, and one took place during the school year. So it was 2 days a week while you were attending lectures. And then in May and June, there was a full-time placement at a second agency. And it was in April, I guess, that Miss Lee came to the school and asked if I might work with her So for May and June, I was assigned to do my field work with Miss Lee. And it was sometime in April that a Manning pool was opened in an exhibition park in Vancouver for Japanese families who were moved off the west coast from Prince Rupert in the northern part of British Columbia, and along that whole stretch where there were a number of Japanese settlements, fishing villages, as well as pulp and paper mill towns. And so all of those families were moved down to Vancouver to be held in this exhibition park, while the government made some other arrangements to evacuate them. And it was in that process that I got.
Okay, you used a term that I've not heard before. Could you tell me what a Manning pool is?
Oh, well, I guess it's like a place where people are brought temporarily. The exhibition park had been used to by the Army, I guess, because I'm not sure. When I went in there in May of 1942 to work with Miss Lee, it was the livestock barns, you know, that were converted into dormitories for the women and children. And then there were Army-style kitchens that were set up so that, and they were fed Army-style food with saltpeter in it. Oh, I can't remember the diarrhea because of that saltpeter. For these families that were given, say, 48 hours notice and brought into Vancouver from the northern settlements.
Excuse me, Kay, you said that the women and children were housed in the livestock stalls, which had been converted to dormitories. Where were the men, the Japanese men?
Well, the men between 18 and 45 were removed from their families to be sent to road camps. And some of, I guess, they were housed separately from the women and children. All I can remember is Miss Lee saying, well, perhaps you should go to the dormitory where the women and children are and see what you can do to help some of them who are really pretty upset because their menfolk have been separated from them, you know, in such short notice. And they're wondering how they're going to survive without their husbands. And so I remember walking through this dorm, and the terrible stench mixed with bleach, and the children screaming and hanging onto their mother's skirts, and the women trying to create some sense of privacy by hanging blankets between the stalls. And eventually what I did was I met a school teacher, a Japanese school teacher, a woman who had taught Japanese in one of the settlements up near Prince Rupert, and spending some time, because she seemed to be the providing some leadership. And I was just bewildered by all this. I mean, student, and you're expected to go in there all by myself and do something about a situation that was so appalling.
I'll never forget that moment of sheer helplessness. Where do I begin? I mean, Miss Lee isn't here to provide any kind of supervision. You know, all she suggested is that I walk through there and see what I can do about helping the women with, you know, some of their problems, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure where to begin. Anyways, what this school teacher suggested was that maybe if I could coax some of the children out into the bright sunshine, the mothers might have an opportunity to kind of tidy up their living spaces, and then once they're settled, they might be prepared to come and see me to talk to me about some of their problems, which is very good advice. So I took a few of the children, and we started playing Ring Around the Rosie. And this teacher helped. You know, the mothers were willing to let their children go with Mrs. Tanaka, and out to where I was starting to play some games with the children.
So that was your first exposure to the Manning Pool at Hastings Park?
Yes. And then eventually, of course, they learned about my presence within the welfare office that was located in the exhibition park. And so they came with their problems, and a lot of them, of course, were wondering about how they were going to manage and what was going to happen to them. Their husbands were already separated from them, and they just were pretty bewildered about what might lie ahead. And I really didn't have too many answers. While they were in Hastings Park, they were provided with food and shelter. And people were expected to use whatever savings they had to provide, you know, for spending money on other things. You know, and there wasn't very much I could do except to kind of reassure them in the best way I could. I couldn't really offer them that much reassurance. It was a terrible time. I can just remember it as a terribly confusing time, and not.
It must have been somewhere around very early in your experiences there. I believe it was in early 1942 that the federal act was passed to confiscate property from the Japanese.
Well, actually they were supposed to be entrusted. All properties were entrusted with the custodian of enemy alien property, and at the point of leaving your home, the custodian was supposed to protect whatever was left behind. And there was no thought that, you know, properties would be sold without your consent. In 1942, it was a little later that the government decided that all these properties could be sold without the consent of the owners. There was a difference between American and Canadian way of dealing with the Japanese population. In the United States, the Bill of Rights protected the property rights of the Japanese Americans, and so the Japanese Americans were able to go back to their properties, and they were able to go back in 1945 as soon as peace was declared between Japan and the United States. Whereas in Canada, it was 1949 before our civil rights were restored to us, and at that point, you know, we were even allowed to vote. So I was 29 before I could vote. You know, it was even possible to vote in British Columbia from 1949 on. But there was nothing to go back to because our properties had been sold without our consent.
So in 1942, that was not one of the worries that you had to
No,
deal with?
no.
That happened later?
Actually, people felt that, you know, the government would protect our properties, and we would have something to go back to.
Okay, did you continue your work with the BC Security Commission in Vancouver for the next while?
Well, I was then sent, I guess, in the month of June, when the BC Security Commission set up their first, I guess they called them, what do they call? They called them ghost towns. Reception center, concentration camp, internment. I don't know. We called them ghost towns, where families were moved to. They established in some of the abandoned mining towns in the interior of British Columbia, centers where the Japanese could be sent. And the first one was in CASW, and Miss Lee asked if I might help set up a welfare office there. So as a student, I went to CASW. And it was much pleasanter there. Scenery was beautiful, and it was getting on into, you know, the nice weather in the interior of British Columbia. Certainly the accommodation was not ideal, but it was better than Hastings Park.
What was the accommodation like?
Well, some of the old hotels that used to be saloons were converted into emergency housing for the families, and you know, there were rooms which were used as bedrooms, and then common areas which were used as kitchens and eating areas. And in CASW, it was that way. So, you know, there were fairly decent hotel rooms that were available for, and so there was privacy for families. And then work crews came in, and I know that in CASW they set up a big public bath, and it was kind of fun to share in that kind of, you know, Japanese style living again. I think people were very happy to get out of Hastings Park.
Mm-hmm. What was your professional work like at that time? What were you doing?
Well, families who had no savings, of course, or depleted their savings, needed some money in order to buy food. Shelter was provided, but people were expected to cook for themselves. And once we got into the camps, everybody cooked for themselves. And so the welfare office had to arrange for income maintenance for families who were destitute to buy their food. At least people were able to, you know, they just weren't handed out stuff. They were able to pick and choose whatever they cooked for themselves. And then, you know, there would be families very concerned about, wives very concerned about their husbands, what was happening to them, and so we would make inquiries about what was happening to other members of the family. But mainly it was income maintenance.
Yeah. And how long did you stay then in CASW?
Well, I came back then to take the summer course in order to complete my requirements for the diploma. And when I came back to the University of British Columbia for that summer course, there were
I guess I was the only Japanese Canadian student left on campus. All the others, the men had to leave before they graduated, I think, some of them. But once the school year the academic year was over, no other students were admitted to the university. And Miss Lee had to ask for special permission for me to come back from the ghost town in order to complete my course. It was a kind of a funny feeling that summer to be the only Japanese student on campus.
So as you finished your work at the university, and
well, that would have been in September. I went to work for the BC Security Commission, and that's when my family really were pretty upset. It was okay to be doing some student field work, but to become an employee of the BC Security Commission was something that was unacceptable. And so I made a break with my family at that point, because I felt there was something that maybe I could do, you know, even working with the commission. Because somebody had to be doing it. I felt maybe I could do it in a way that would be least harmful for people. So I made a break with my family at that point and went to work for the BC Security Commission.
it must have been very difficult for you.
Yeah, it was. But I really, I liked Miss Lee. I felt she was someone who was doing the very best she could under the circumstances. And the people she hired to be welfare supervisors in the different camps. By that time there was a camp at Sandon and a camp in New Denver, one in the Slocan Valley, another one set up in Greenwood, and then eventually one set up in Tashmi. And the people whom she hired as supervisors were people who we could work with very comfortably.
And was your work at the BC Security Commission as a paid employee, was that similar to what you'd been doing before?
Yes. Just an extension of what I'd been doing as a student. I stayed with it until April of 1943. And at that point, I'd been in New Denver and Slocan, and then my last posting was in Tashmi. And Tashmi was a community that was built up near Hope in a kind of a valley, and a new town created just to house the Japanese families. And most of the families who went to Tashmi were from Vancouver, because Vancouver was the last area to be evacuated. And once the evacuation was completed, then the BC Security Commission and the federal government started looking at how they might disperse the Japanese. And a great many families had chosen not to go to these camps, but to move as a family unit, because they had this choice, to farms on the prairies, to sugar beet farms. Then they could remain as a family unit. Those families who were sent to camps, to these interior camps, the males over 18 and under 45 were not allowed to accompany their families. And so then the push was on to disperse people from these camps. And the choice became either you went east of the Rockies, and by this time we were beginning to hear all kinds of horror stories about what happened to families who went to the prairies. They were housed in chicken coops. The job was very hard.
life was even more primitive than it had been than it was in the evacuation camps and centers in the interior of British Columbia. So, and then city after city in eastern Canada was saying, well, we don't want the Japs in Toronto, in London, in Kitchener, and all these other little towns. We don't want to have the kind of problem that British Columbia had with its Oriental population. And so, you know, people in the camps were beginning to feel very much that, you know, it was maybe safer to stay in the camps, or even to consider going to Japan. And when the choice was, you know, you either move east of the Rockies or you sign up to go to Japan, it became an impossible choice. And the welfare workers had to confront people with that choice. And at that point, I began to think that my parents were right, you know, that I should never have accepted this job. And so I resigned and said, well, if you're going to ask people to go east of the Rockies, maybe I need to go east of the Rockies in order to see what it really is like. The only choice open then was to sign up for a job. And for girls, the only job that was open was as a domestic. And so I signed a contract to work for in a domestic situation with a woman in Forest Hill in Toronto.
Excuse me, okay, maybe we can... Kay, I've appreciated what you've told us about your work with the BC Security Commission and your reasons for leaving there. You then applied for a job in Toronto, and what happened then?
Well, that position was filled before I arrived in Toronto, which left me then free to look for a social work job. And so I went to the Y because I'd had some very pleasant student fieldwork experience in the Vancouver Y. That eventually led me to a farm service job because the National Y was staffing the farm service camps during the war. And there was a position of recreation assistant available in the Vineland farm service camp. Had a kind of a unpleasant episode around that one. They first agreed to hire me as a recreation assistant and then changed their mind. Felt that perhaps because I was Japanese, the girls might not accept me too happily. However, I could go as a camp assistant. Camp assistant meant peeling the potatoes and cleaning the johns and scrubbing the dormitory floors. And at that point I had no choice. So I went out as a camp assistant and spent the summer helping the recreation assistant, who was a second-year phys ed student at the University of Toronto, organize activities for the 100 girls who were there at the camp. So I turned out to be the best damn camp assistant they had.
With a master's degree?
Ready to do, you know, some other things as well. And the camp director really appreciated, you know, the kind of efforts I put into that summer's experience. And eventually that led to a letter inviting me to apply to the University Settlement House as a program director for their, well, not program person, not director, program person for their young people's activities.
So you began work at the University Settlement House in, was it?
In 1943, September of 1943.
What were you doing there as a program person?
Looking after the young adult and teenage activities. So, you know, working with kids from about 13 up to 30.
I understand that at that time, when you were at the University Settlement House, there was a fair bit of tension between the staff and the board of the organization about professionalization. Were you part of that?
I guess
discussion?
maybe there were some difficulties. I know that the head resident welcomed me as a trained social worker because none of her staff had any professional training.
Who was that, Kay?
It was Frances Crowther, and she was a very thoughtful and far-sighted person. I enjoyed working with her. She gave me a number of opportunities to expand in different directions and respond to the kinds of ideas that were coming from the teenage group. And I know that on occasion I had, some opposition from other staff people, but Mrs. Crowther usually was supportive of different initiatives that I suggested as a result of ideas that were coming forward from the groups that I worked with. For instance, one of the teenage groups wanted to have their executive group meet on a Sunday afternoon, and the Settlement House had never opened its doors on a Sunday afternoon. But when I requested that be considered, other staff people were horrified. Mrs. Crowther felt that if I were prepared to be available, there was no reason why we couldn't meet that request. And when I think of how effective those Sunday afternoon executive meetings were with that teenage group, I think it was well worth spending a couple of hours on a Sunday afternoon meeting with them.
In the relationships between you and your colleagues on staff, were there discussions, or what kind of discussions took place about the merits or disadvantages of professional social work education?
Oh, I can't recall that we had any in-depth discussion. It seemed to me there was always this sort of hidden antagonism from the group who had been staff members there for a long time, and then the new group who were being hired by Mrs. Crowther, who had more professional training. One longtime staff person eventually went to the University of Pittsburgh to get her MSW, and when she came back, she went in 1944, so a year after I was hired, and I was there for 4 years, and in the last year that I was there, she had come back from Pittsburgh and very enthusiastic about some of the new ideas that she'd picked up during the course of her training, and there was quite a change in the way in which settlement activities were organized in that final year that I was on staff because of the change of direction generated by that staff person.
Who was that individual?
Molly Donaldson.
At that time, was Kay Gorey at all involved in the University Settlement House?
Her name sounds familiar, but she certainly was not a part of the staff when I was there.
Mm-hmm. To your recollection, how was the professional association, the Canadian Association of Social Workers, involved in this, in these discussions about professionalism versus untrained staff people?
I was a member of CASW at that time, but not really very active on the executive. This was a point at which I was being courted and then got married and became
pregnant. So, you know, very little time aside from doing the job and being involved in those kinds of activities. So that I was aware, you know, peripherally of that kind of discussion going on, and some people having heated arguments about professionalism. But, you know, in the group work agencies, there were so few trained staff. We were in a real minority. That I guess among the staff, that kind of discussion was not all that current.
You mentioned, Kay, that you were being courted and married, and did that cause you to decide to leave the University Settlement House?
Well, in 1947, I had a baby, and my husband was working on his master's in mathematical statistics, and he was not able to find a job in Toronto, but found one in Ottawa. And so in 1948 we moved. I didn't go back to the settlement house after having the baby.
So, having arrived in Ottawa in 1948, how did you spend your first several years here?
Well, I remember being active as a chairman of a younger membership committee in the Y. I guess I gravitated to the Y because I'd had that very pleasant experience as a student in Vancouver. And Charlotte Burchard was active in the Y at the time. And she invited me to, we had mutual friends. My husband worked with a friend of theirs in the Dominion Bureau of Statistics. And through them we met the Burchards, and then Charlotte invited me to consider doing some volunteer work with the Y. So there was that brief period when I did work with the Younger Membership Committee as chairman. Then, because of our daughter's handicap, she was a cerebral palsy child, I became very much involved with parents of cerebral palsy children in setting up a treatment center and becoming a volunteer parent in that program. So my involvement with the Y kind of gradually diminished.
And did you return to paid employment sometime in those early years?
No, really, you know, during the years that we had Sachi, it was a pretty demanding caring situation for her, and I found very little time to do anything but work with the treatment center and care for her. And I didn't go back into the field until after her death in 1954.
You began work then at the Children's Aid Society.
That's right. You know, in those days, even the Children's Aid Society had very few MSWs. I just had a diploma in social work, but I guess it was considered an equivalent to an MSW. Not quite equivalent these days, but in those days it was certainly considered by CASW to be about on a par. After a year as a field worker for the Children's Aid, I became a supervisor.
Okay, during the next 15 years, if my mathematics served me right, you not only had 3 more children, but you were also involved in a number of daycare activities in the community. For the years up until the early 70s, your volunteer work seemed to be a major part of your work activity. How did you find being a volunteer as opposed to being a paid staff member? Were you dealt with differently than you had been before?
Well, I guess my most heavy commitment was to the CCF and the New Democratic Party, actually, during the years that my children were young. But when I had my third child, in that period of 5 years, I really began to wonder if I knew enough about child rearing. I found myself being very impatient with my older daughter, who at that point was 4. I guess she was 4 when the third one was born. And I started taking early childhood education courses. First attending a parent preschool center, which was conducted in the old Unitarian Church on Elgin Street, and then attending courses at night at Algonquin College, and learning a great deal more about how children develop and the kinds of play material, which can be far more stimulating than maybe other kinds of play material. And so I became a discussion leader for the Parent Preschool Center, a registrar. There were various ways in which I worked with that program. I began to realize how terribly important those early years are in the life of an individual. And also began to realize how very much mothers of young children need some kind of support. The change from being a wife to being a mother as well is one in which I think we get very little preparation for. And those are very critical years for young children. So then, during those years, I began to say to myself, in spite of all the psychology courses I've taken, I really needed a lot more help. And somehow I found that help. And so when I go back into social work, I will really spend some time looking at that field as an area which needs some attention. Also, when I was a children's aid worker, I was assigned some very difficult cases where one particular case that I recall was that of a girl of 12 who'd been in about 22 different foster placements. The problems that she exhibited at the age of 12 were apparent in the preschool years, and yet nothing was done in those early years to help her and her family deal with some of the difficulties that they were experiencing. And eventually, what I was able to do as a children's aid worker was to find a placement for her in Warrendale. And at Warrendale, I became both her child care worker and remained the family's protection worker. And at Warrendale, they were able to help this child over a period of 5 years to be able to cope with her life in a much more adequate way. And you know, that experience, coupled with my own experience as a mother of 3 preschool children, certainly made me do a lot of thinking about what I might do with the rest of my life.
And as it turned out, when you returned to paid employment in 1968, you were doing work in the daycare field.
Mm-hmm. I started by mobilizing the women in the CCF to do some study about daycare and the daycare legislation, and offering our services
to the Ottawa Welfare Council then to look at the daycare issues. And it just so happened that at that point the Ontario government was changing its legislation so that it became much more favorable for municipalities to purchase more daycare services and establish daycare centers and that sort of thing. And the Welfare Council was setting up a daycare task force. And so as a member of a political organization, I became a part of a task force on daycare. And then was invited by Charlotte Burchard, whom I really hadn't had much contact with in the years between, to consider being an intake social worker at the Andrew Fleck Center in 1965, I think, 1965. And I was able to take then my youngest child to the daycare center, and just work the school hours, so that the two older ones were in school by that time, and I worked from about 9:30 until about 3:30. And then eventually that led to a job as coordinator of daycare services for the regional municipality.
So you began working for the regional municipality of Ottawa Carleton
In 1968.
1968.
Or 69. It became the region in 69, actually.
In 69. And over the next several years, well, since then actually, you've been employed by the social services or social welfare department.
Actually, I resigned from the social services department in 1971 when the job, by that time, the daycare budget had been increased from $40,000 in 1968, let's see, and to about $650,000 in 1971, and I was still the only permanent staff person to manage that budget. An operations and methods study of the department in 1970 had indicated that the daycare services needed about 4 staff in order to administrate that budget. And nothing seemed to be happening. And it looked like more funding was going to be available from provincial sources to actually build daycare centers by 1971. And as a social worker, I really didn't know how to build new centers. Up to that point, we'd been purchasing services from existing centers, privately operated, setting up some municipal operations for Head Start nurseries, schools, but not building buildings in which we set up full daycare centers. And so I thought maybe it was a good time to leave. And so I worked at Carleton University for 2 years as a research assistant in early childhood development from 1971 to 73.
And then when you returned to regional government in 1973, what was it that encouraged you to go back?
Well, a job became available in the development of neighborhood-based community service centers. That was something that was begun by the Social Planning Council in the late 60s in Lower Town, where urban renewal was creating a lot of difficulties for families that were dislocated by the whole thrust of urban renewal. And agencies were finding it very difficult to meet the kinds of demands that were arising in Lower Town. And by 1973, the Regional Municipality Social Services Department was involved in providing some temporary funding
for the Lower Town Center and another center that had been established in the Dalhousie Ward area. The coordinator of that program, who had started with the Social Planning Council, resigned in March of '73, and the job was vacant for some time. But at the point when I heard about it, I found that in working at Carleton University, that once you get a research program started, there's no way you can change the way in which the research or the experimental thrust of the research is being conducted. I could see by the time I was in my second year at Carleton that there were all kinds of things that should be modified about the way in which that experiment was being conducted if it was to be more effective. And I found it very frustrating just to keep on doing the same old things so that the research results would not be distorted. And so I was glad to consider moving out of research. I discovered I was not a researcher, and to apply. I'd had a very satisfying experience working with Stuart Godfrey in daycare. I knew that he and I would be able to work together, and the community service centers offered the possibility of maybe providing for families of young children the kind of supports that I felt they needed, that were reinforced by my experience at Carleton and the experience I'd had as the coordinator of daycare services previously. And when I discussed some of those ideas with Stuart Godfrey, he certainly supported me in some of the ideas that I shared with him in considering applying for this job. Mm-hmm. And so, I won the competition and was very happy to come back into the Social Services Department to do that.
Mr. Godfrey was Commissioner of Social Services at that time, was he not? Mm-hmm. Regarding the Community Service Center, what was the, you spoke of services to families, were there, what theoretical social considerations were you hoping to accomplish through the promotion of that kind of idea?
Well, you know, the problem in Lower Town, when urban renewal created so many stresses for families, was in providing services in a way that brought agencies that were going in and out of, several different agencies going out of the same home, and not really working in a coordinated way around some of the needs that were being expressed by those families, that I thought were being addressed in a much more rational way.
Through the
establishment of a neighborhood base, bringing together a number of agencies in one spot, where case conferencing and sorting out of who was to be the primary worker and who then also might share in some of the support services that might be required for those families could be thought through more rationally.
So the whole idea then of access, easier access and more sensible access to social and health services was something that could become a reality through these centers.
Yes, yeah. And then it seemed to me that families of young children could then be supported in a much more effective way through having health services, through the public health nurse, the recreational resources, the kinds of parenting groups through the family agencies, the homemaking services through our own department, all those things brought together in a way that made some sense, and through a much better planning of the use of those resources. And that, I still believe that very much. And through the years, from 1973 until 1979, when my job changed within the department, I was able to add 5 more centers, and then so that made it up to 7. And then when I became after Mr. Godfrey's retirement, and under the new commissioner, there was a reorganization of the department, which resulted in my becoming one of 4 district directors. And in the district in which I had responsibility, was able to establish 2 more centers. So at this point, we have 9 neighborhood-based health and social service centers in Ottawa Carleton.
That's quite an accomplishment, Kay. In your current responsibility, are you currently a district director?
Yes, I'm now in another district, and you know, it's been an opportunity as a district director to look at other functions which the department has responsibility for. As a director of community service centers, it seemed possible to work with a number of agencies in the community and to enlist their support for the notion of better access in a more coordinated way of their services. The difficulty seemed to be because of the way in which the social services department was structured, to integrate the services of the social services department in the work that was being done in community service centers. And
so I didn't quite understand that. The difficulty was to integrate within the department rather than in the community.
That was one of the difficulties that I faced as the director of community service centers. It seemed possible to work with other agencies outside the department, but to get departmental services integrated in such a way that general welfare assistance clients were being better served through community service centers. The elderly and the chronically handicapped, whom our special care workers were seeing, being supported by the health services that were in the community service centers. The home help services were gradually absorbed. You know, the teaching homemaker home help services were brought in to be a part of community service centers, but it was difficult to go beyond that. And as a district director, it has been possible then to look at the whole department and to have some say in the way in which other departmental services can be better integrated, rationalized, administered, you know, so that I think it's been worthwhile to shift the area of responsibility into a much more comprehensive one as a district director.
Okay, as we move toward the end of our time together, I want to ask you a couple of general questions about your career, if I might. One is in relation to the goals, the reasons that you came into social work. Perhaps bearing in mind the reservations that your family had about your going into this kind of work. What do you think now about the things that you hope to accomplish in the beginning?
Well, I think social reform comes about because there are people both within a system and without a system who want to change the way in which the structures in society respond to the needs of people. And I felt that the Social Services Department dealt with those people in the community who were most vulnerable. It also spent a great deal of money on providing income maintenance as well as grants and purchase of service arrangements and direct services in the personal social service field. And that if one wanted to do something about that most vulnerable population in the community, that the Social Services Department was a good place to work in. I guess I feel it's possible, even within the system, because there have to be some of us who are prepared to fight for change within a system, and to have that system respond to what is out there in the community. And I feel that that was possible with Stuart Godfrey, and it's still possible with Art Pope, and that we have in Ottawa Carleton as a result of having a council composed of people who have been active in the community activists.
This is the city council you're speaking of?
Yeah, as well as some staff who have been interested in providing a better service, a social service department which responds to the needs of people in a more enlightened way than maybe other social service departments do. I don't know, maybe, working within a system was partly a reaction against the radicalism of my parents. And tempering some of that radicalism, because they made me feel very uncomfortable. As a child, I felt very much sort of out of the mainstream of Japanese society, because they were more radical than their friends, and we were considered sort of, a little queer because of my parents' involvement with the reform group in the Japanese community. And then I also, I guess, strove very hard to be a part of establishment, because I wanted to be accepted by the mainstream of Canadian society. And so the compromise has been to work within an establishment agency rather than working outside the system and manning the barricades in the way that my parents would have wanted me to.
And what about your volunteer work now, Kay?
Well, it's pretty well limited to the Japanese Community Association, which my husband and I were instrumental in getting established back in 1975. Well, all through the years that we lived in Ottawa, we kept alive
some kind of association with the Japanese community. But in 1975, it became very important for us to organize something to celebrate the 100th year of the first known immigrant of Japanese origin landing in Canada. So we celebrated what we called our centennial in 1977. And the Community Association has continued to flourish because there have been other issues that, as a racial group, we have had to consider. And the current issue, of course, is one of redress. And there are those of us in the community who would like to have some kind of formal apology from the federal government about the wrongs that have been inflicted on the Japanese-Canadian community. There was no known act of sabotage ever committed. The military did not think that we were a security risk back in the 40s. The RCMP did not think that we were a security risk, and yet, because there were very vocal politicians, purely on the basis of race, the whole Japanese community was destroyed. And when I think of what it has done to us psychologically, in a sense, I mean, some of us survived very well, and I'm one of the ones that survived that experience, probably in a way that some people might think opened up opportunities for me that might not have been opened up. I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure that I couldn't have been a director of a human resource center in Vancouver. It would have been nice to have considered that possibility. However, I think that redress has to go beyond just asking for a formal apology. There has to be some kind of monetary compensation so that a government in Canada will never again consider something like this happening to another racial group.
Okay, I feel sure that you'll carry through your skill and your enthusiasm for your for your interest into the work of the Redress Committee. I want to thank you very much for granting us this interview today, for spending your time with us. I certainly have enjoyed and very much appreciate your willingness to share your experiences with us. Thank you.
Yeah.
Crowder?
Mm-hmm. That's right. And it's Francis's E.
And Charlotte Burchard.
That's
and
right.
Warrendale.
Warrendale.
I think that was it. When I was interviewing Stuart Sutton, he was talking about his African friends with their many syllabled names.
Yeah.
Quite a challenge. Well, so how was it?
I don't know. It's very hard to tell when you're involved in it, how it's going to sound, what it's going to look like. I must say, I always feel that it's not quite the way it was. I was interviewed about Pearl Harbor by Dean Tower a year ago. And you gave me a lot of preparation, so I was a little better prepared. His researcher called me, and we talked about a number of things, and I thought that's what we were going to talk about. And then I never met Dean until the camera started rolling, and it was a live broadcast. I watched it on tape later. It was rebroadcast later. I watched it on tape later, but oh my.
As far as I know, the only question that I really sprung on you was the one about the University Settlement House.
Yeah, that I didn't mind it. And in walked this, and I knew he was going to be there. He he said, I saw your name on, I saw Shimizu on the, because I was known as couple at the time, and I got married partly through my experience at the seminar. He said, I wondered if it was going to be you. Say, you don't look very much